In the cutthroat world of Connecticut high society, family is just a corporation where bloodlines are line items. For 21 years, I served as their unpaid CEO and glorified housekeeper, keeping their fragile empire from collapsing. My parents thought they could simply downsize me with an eviction notice. Forgetting that I am the only one who actually reads the fine print, they want to play by the rules. Fine, I will show them the true cost of blind loyalty. My name is Claudia Pennington, and I am the reason the crystal chandeliers in the Sterling Manor ballroom are not currently vibrating from the base of a sound system that was wired incorrectly by a vendor who claimed to be the best in the tri-state area. I am the reason the governor is currently laughing at a joke my father, Richard Sterling, did not actually write, and I am the reason my mother, Eleanor Vance, is wearing a vintage emerald necklace that was technically seized by the IRS 3 years ago, but which I managed to legally reclaim through a loophole involving a shell company in Delaware. I am 37 years old, standing in the shadows of the service corridor, holding a tablet that contains the entire nervous system of this family. To the 300 guests sipping champagne out there, I am invisible. Occasionally, someone might mistake me for a high-end event planner or perhaps a personal assistant who has overstayed her welcome. But mostly, they do not see me at all. They see the spectacle. They see the facade. Through the sliver of the velvet curtain, I watched my parents. Richard Sterling, at 65 years old, still possessed that silver fox charm that made investors open their checkbooks before they even read the prospectus. He was holding a flute of champagne, tilting his head back in that practiced, aristocratic laugh that suggested he had never known a day of worry in his life. Beside him, Eleanor, 60, looked like a porcelain doll that had been preserved in a vacuum-sealed chamber. Her smile was tight, her posture perfect. They were the king and queen of Connecticut high society, icons of stability and old money. It was a beautiful lie. If I were to walk out onto that stage and unplug my tablet, the Sterling Empire would dissolve into chaos within 48 hours. My parents were not the masters of their universe. They were merely its mascots. I checked the time on my wrist. It was 9 o'clock at night. I had been awake since 4 in the morning. My day had not begun with the gala. It had begun with a call from our private banker in Zurich regarding a compliance issue that Richard had ignored for 6 months. After solving that by rewriting a disclosure form and forging my father's digital signature with his standing permission. Of course, I had moved on to managing Eleanor's medical schedule. This was a polite euphemism for ensuring her supply of prescription mood stabilizers was refilled, and that her dermatologist did not double book her Botox appointment with the wife of the senator she was currently feuding with. I was not just a daughter, I was the chief executive officer, the chief financial officer, the press secretary, and the cleaner. I adjusted my headset as the catering manager approached me. Looking panicked. "We have a problem with table 5, he whispered, sweat beading on his forehead. "The senator's wife is demanding the vegan option, but she is eating the filet mignon." "Let her eat it," I said, my voice flat. "If she asks, tell her the cow was raised on a diet of strictly organic grass and massaged with essential oils. She will believe you. Just keep the wine flowing." He nodded and scurried away. I looked back at my parents. They were clinking glasses. They had no idea that the catering company had threatened to walk out 2 hours ago because the deposit check had bounced due to a clerical error by the new accounting firm Richard insisted we hire. I had covered the $20,000 from my personal savings account just to keep the waiters in the room. I had not told them. I never told them. It was easier to fix the world than to explain to them that it was broken. This dynamic was not new. It was the only language we knew how to speak. My mind drifted back to the beginning of this servitude. I was 16 years old. The year was 2005. I had come home from boarding school to find my mother weeping on the floor of her dressing room and my father sitting in his study, staring at a revolver on his desk. They had been swindled. A classic Ponzi scheme disguised as a revolutionary tech investment. They had leveraged everything: the house, the cars, the portfolio on a promise of a 300% return. They were going to lose it all. They were terrified children in the bodies of adults. completely incapable of navigating a crisis that did not involve a social snub. I did not weep. I did not panic. I walked into that study, took the revolver, and locked it in the safe. Then I sat down and read every single document on the desk. I spent the next 6 months skipping classes to meet with forensic accountants and liquidation lawyers. I found the clauses they had missed. I negotiated payment plans. I restructured the debt. I sold the vacation home in the Hamptons before the bank could seize it, using the liquid cash to settle the most aggressive creditors. By the time I was 17, I had saved them. I remembered the look in Richard's eyes back then. It was not pride, it was relief. Certainly. But underneath that was something else, acknowledgement. He realized that his teenage daughter possessed the ruthless pragmatism he pretended to have. From that day on, the power dynamic shifted. They stopped parenting me, and I started managing them for 21 years. I had kept the ship afloat. They did not know the combination to the wall safe in the master bedroom. They did not know the name of the tax attorney who kept them out of federal prison every April. They did not even know how to reset the Wi-Fi router. I was the institutional memory. I was the fail-safe. However, the atmosphere in Sterling Manor had changed in the last 6 months. The air had grown heavy with a new, unfamiliar tension. It started with the arrival of Elias Thorne. I watched him now, working the room with a predatory grace that mirrored my father's. Elias was 28 years old, handsome in a slick, modern way, with eyes that were too alert and a smile that didn't quite reach them. He was my father's protégé, a vague title that covered a multitude of sins. The official story was that Elias was the son of an old business partner, here to learn the ropes. The unofficial rumor, which I had confirmed via a DNA test I ran on a discarded coffee cup 3 months ago, was that Elias was Richard's son from an affair in the late 90s. Richard did not know I knew. Elias did not know I knew, but his presence was a cancer growing in the heart of my operations. Elias was not content to just be the long-lost son enjoying the perks of the trust fund. He was ambitious. He used buzzwords like synergy and asset optimization. He sat in on meetings where he had no business being, nodding sagely while I explained complex tax structures. I saw him whisper something to my father. Richard laughed, clapping a hand on Elias's shoulder. It was a gesture of affection I had not received in a decade. My father looked at Elias and saw a reflection of the man he wished he was. When he looked at me, he saw the man he actually was, incompetent and dependent, and he resented me for it. I felt a vibration in my pocket. It was a notification from the estate's primary server. Access denied. I frowned. I was trying to remotely approve a payment for the tent rental, but my credentials had been rejected. I tried again. Access denied. Administrator privileges required. My heart gave a cold, hard thump against my ribs. I was the administrator. I had built the system. I looked up across the room. Elias was looking at me. He raised his glass in a mock salute, a smirk playing on his lips. Then he turned back to my mother, offering her his arm to lead her to the dance floor. A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning settled over me. Over the past few weeks, there had been signs, small things, glitches. The private banker in Zurich had been hesitant on the phone, mentioning that he had received conflicting instructions. My mother had stopped asking me to review her charity speeches, handing them to Elias instead. There had been closed-door meetings in the library, conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered the room. I had dismissed it as paranoia. I had told myself that they needed me too much. You do not fire your oxygen supply. You do not evict your own spine. But standing there in the shadows, watching my family celebrate their success while I held a tablet that no longer recognized my authority, I realized I had made a fundamental calculation error. I had assumed that my value to them was based on my competence. I had forgotten that for people like Richard and Eleanor, competence was threatening. They did not want a manager. They wanted an audience. And Elias Thorne was a very good audience. I turned away from the curtain and walked briskly down the hallway toward the library. The gala was in full swing. No one would miss me for 10 minutes. I needed to know what was happening. The library was dark. smelling of old leather and expensive scotch. I went straight to the heavy oak desk that had been my command center since high school. I sat down and booted up the desktop computer. Password incorrect. I stared at the screen. My password had been the same for 10 years. It was a complex alphanumeric string that no one else knew. I tried the recovery phrase, invalid. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. They were trying to lock me out. They were trying to erase me from the digital infrastructure I had built, but they had forgotten who they were dealing with. I was not just the user, I was the architect. I reached under the desk and pressed a hidden panel I had installed 5 years ago when we renovated the electrical system. A small, secure drive popped out. It was my back door. A physical override that bypassed the main network protocols. I plugged it in. The screen flickered, and then a command prompt appeared. I bypassed the new firewall Elias had likely paid some consultant a fortune to install and access the root directory. I did not look for the party planning files. I went straight to the financial correspondence folder. There were hundreds of emails between my father and Mr. Myers, the family's external counsel, a man who had always looked at me with the disdain one reserves for hired help. I scanned the subject lines: draft resolution, termination of agency, asset transfer schedule. My stomach turned. I opened the most recent attachment, a PDF dated just 2 days ago. It was a bank statement from the Cayman Islands. I scanned the numbers. It was a transfer record. $10 million moved from the primary operating account, the account I used to pay the staff. The taxes, the maintenance into a new entity called the Sterlingthorne Trust. Sterlingthorne. I scrolled down to the signatory page. There was my father's signature, shaky but legible. There was Elias Thorne's signature, bold and arrogant, and under the section for authorized trustees, my name was nowhere to be found. I sat back in the leather chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating my face. The noise of the party was a dull roar in the distance, a celebration of a dynasty that was actively cannibalizing its own foundation. They were not just hiding money, they were moving it. They were preparing to cut the cord. I looked at the date on the transfer. It was executed yesterday. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't sorrow. It wasn't even anger. Not yet. It was the cold, hollow realization of a machine that has been deemed obsolete. I had given them 21 years of my life. I had sacrificed my 20s, my social life, and any chance of a normal career to keep their delusions of grandeur alive. I was a tool they had used to fix their broken lives, and now that the repairs were done, they were discarding the wrench. I printed the document. The printer whirred softly in the darkness, the sound like a whispered secret. I folded the paper and slipped it into the inside pocket of my blazer, right next to my heart. Out in the ballroom, the orchestra began to play a waltz. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and walked to the door. I would go back out there. I would oversee the rest of the gala. I would make sure the senator's wife got her vegan meal and that the valet parking ran smoothly. I would continue to be the perfect, invisible daughter for exactly as long as it took me to burn their world to the ground. They thought they were cutting me off. They had no idea they were unplugging the life support. I opened the library door and stepped back into the light. The game had changed, but the rules remained the same. Read everything. Sign nothing, and never let them see you bleed. The invasion began not with a bang, but with a series of aggressive redecorations and buzzwords that sounded impressive until you actually dissected their meaning. 2 days after the gala, I walked into the estate management office, a room I had occupied for nearly 2 decades, to find my ergonomic chair pushed into a corner and Elias Thorne sitting behind my mahogany desk. He was on a call, his feet propped up on the leather blotter I had given my father for his 60th birthday. He did not apologize when he saw me. He merely pointed a finger at the phone, signaling me to wait. I stood there, holding a stack of invoices for the pool maintenance, listening to him butcher the English language with corporate jargon. "We need to synergize the vendor relationships," he was saying, his voice loud and performative. "We are looking for a holistic approach to the groundskeeping. I want to leverage our brand equity to drive down operational expenditures." I stared at him, He was talking to the landscaping company. They cut grass and trimmed hedges. They did not care about brand equity. They cared about being paid on time. When he finally hung up, he flashed me a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Claudia," he said, acting as if he were welcoming a guest into his home. "I was just doing some deep dives into the ledger. We are bleeding money on these service contracts. I am going to optimize the cash flow." I walked over and placed the invoices on the corner of the desk, reclaiming a small square of territory. Those contracts have been negotiated over 15 years. "Elias," I said, keeping my voice level, "we pay a premium because they show up at 3 a.m. when a storm knocks a tree onto the driveway. That is not bleeding money. That is buying reliability." Elias waved his hand dismissively. "That is old-school thinking," he said. "We need to disrupt the model. I have found a gig economy app that connects us with freelance maintenance crews. It will cut costs by 40%. I felt a headache blooming behind my right eye. He was treating the Sterling estate like a tech startup, unaware that you cannot disrupt a leaking roof or a flooded basement. You just fix it. This was the new normal. Over the next week, the narrative shifted with terrifying speed. At dinner, a ritual that used to be a silent affair of chewing and sipping, Elias became the center of gravity. My parents, who had previously treated business talk at the table as uncouth, now leaned in, enraptured by his empty projections. We sat in the formal dining room, the long table separating us like a battlefield. The crystal stemware caught the candlelight, casting flickering shadows on my mother's face. "Elias has a vision." "Richard," my mother said, cutting into her squab, "he thinks we should liquidate the municipal bonds and move into cryptocurrency and emerging markets. It sounds so exciting." My father nodded, swirling his wine, a vintage I had sourced for him 5 years ago, which he was now drinking without tasting. "It is bold," my father agreed. "Claudia has always been conservative." He said the word like it was a slur. I set my fork down. "I am not conservative." I said, "I am prudent. The municipal bonds provide the tax-free yield that pays for the property taxes on this house and the maintenance of the yacht. If you sell them, you create a 6-figure tax liability instantly." Elias chuckled, a low, condescending sound. "See," he said, looking at my parents with a conspiratorial grin. "Resistance to change. It is a common friction point in legacy organizations. Claudia is great at keeping the lights on, but she lacks the growth mindset." My mother looked at me, her expression pitying. "Oh, darling," she said, "you do get so bogged down in the details. You have always been a bit rigid. Perhaps that is why you are still single. You worry too much." The insult was precise and practiced. It had nothing to do with the bonds. They were rewriting history in real time. In their version of events, I was not the savior who had pulled them back from the brink of bankruptcy. I was the boring, nagging bureaucrat who held them back from greatness. Elias was the liberator. The exclusion followed the insults. It started with closed doors. I would walk down the hallway and hear laughter from the library, but the moment my hand touched the brass knob, the silence would descend. I was removed from the email chain regarding the renovation of the guest wing. When I asked the architect why I hadn't seen the blueprints, he looked uncomfortable and told me that Mr. Thorne had instructed him to send all files directly to my father. Then came the decision about my niece's boarding school. I had spent months researching Swiss curriculums, leveraging my contacts to ensure she would get an interview at La Rose. I had prepared a 20-page dossier. When I brought it to breakfast on a Tuesday morning, my father waved it away. "Elias handled it," he said, buttering his toast. "He knows a guy on the board of a school in Aspen. It is more modern, more networking-focused." I looked at Elias. He was busy texting. "Aspen?" I asked. "For a girl who wants to study international law." "It is about the ecosystem," Elias mumbled without looking up. I realized then that logic was no longer a currency I could trade in. I stopped arguing. I went silent. This was the most dangerous version of me. Though they were too arrogant to notice, when I stopped speaking, I started recording. I knew that Elias was not just incompetent, He was reckless, and recklessness leaves a trail. I began my own optimization process. Every night, after the house went dark, I engaged in a digital extraction operation. I could not access the main server with my old admin privileges, but I had physical access to the hardware. I used a localized cloner to copy the hard drives of the main household server. I downloaded every email Elias sent. I saved every draft contract. I bought a high-fidelity voice recorder, the kind used by investigative journalists, and slipped it into the flower arrangement in the library during their strategy meetings. I listened to them discuss transferring assets, setting up shell companies, and worst of all, discussing me. She will be a problem. Elias had said on a recording from Thursday night, she knows too much about the bodies buried in the backyard. Metaphorically speaking, we will handle her, my father's voice had replied, sounding tired. She is just an employee. Effectively, we can retire her. Hearing your own father refer to you as an employee to be retired does something to the human soul. It cauterizes the wound. The pain vanishes, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Then came the incident with the governor. It was meant to be Elias's crowning moment. The governor was coming to Sterling Manor for a private lunch to discuss a zoning variance for a new commercial development my father wanted to back. It was a high-stakes meeting. If we got the variance, the land value would triple. Elias insisted on handling the logistics. I have got this. Claudia. He had sneered 2 days prior. You just worry about the flower arrangements. I did not argue. I stepped back and watched. On the day of the lunch, the household was in a frenzy. The chef was preparing a menu of lobster and truffles. My parents were dressed in their finest power suits. Elias was pacing the foyer, checking his watch every 30 seconds. 1 o'clock came. No governor. 1:15. The lobster bisque was getting a skin on top. 1:30. My father was turning a dangerous shade of purple. Call his aide. My father barked at Elias. Elias was sweating. He dialed, listened, and turned pale. He is at the airport. Elias stammered. What my mother shrieked. Which airport? Tweed, New Haven, Elias said, his voice cracking. I sent the car to Tweed. My father threw his napkin on the floor. He flew into Bradley International. You idiot. That is an hour and a half away. He is not going to wait in a terminal for 90 minutes. The room descended into chaos. My father was shouting. Elias was making excuses about the calendar app syncing incorrectly. My mother was moaning about the social humiliation. I stood by the sideboard, perfectly still. I knew exactly what had happened. Elias had assumed the governor would fly private into the smaller local airport, failing to check the flight manifest, which showed he was coming on a commercial flight due to a recent budget scandal where he had pledged to fly economy. It was a rookie mistake. A mistake born of arrogance. I could have let them drown. I could have let Elias crash and burn right there. But 21 years of conditioning is hard to break. And more importantly, the zoning variance was crucial for the estate's solvency. Regardless of who was in charge, I pulled out my phone. I did not call the aide. I called the head of the state police detachment, a man whose daughter's college tuition I had quietly helped navigate via a scholarship fund 3 years ago. Captain, I said softly, turning my back to the chaotic dining room, this is Claudia Sterling. We have a logistical crossover with the governor. He is stranded at Bradley. I need a favor. Can we get a localized escort? I can have a helicopter from our corporate partner land at the executive terminal in 12 minutes. I listened, nodded, and hung up. Then I texted the pilot of the company chopper, who I knew was on standby. I turned back to the room. He will be here in 20 minutes, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. The state police are escorting him to the executive pad, and the helicopter is en route to pick him up. Chef, reheat the bisque in 15 minutes. Mother, fix your lipstick. The silence that followed should have been filled with gratitude. I saw the relief wash over my father's face, but it was instantly replaced by a dark, simmering anger. He looked at Elias, who was slumped in a chair, humiliated. Then he looked at me, standing tall and competent. And he hated me for it. The lunch went ahead. The governor was impressed by the dramatic entrance and the efficiency of the recovery. He signed off on the variance. That evening, I was summoned to the study. I expected a debriefing. I expected, foolishly, a thank you. My father was standing by the window, looking out at the sprawling lawn. Elias was pouring himself a drink, his confidence miraculously restored. That was messy today. "Claudia," my father said without turning around. I blinked. "I beg your pardon," I asked. "I fixed the mess. You undermined Elias," my father said, turning to face me. His eyes were cold. "You made him look incompetent in front of the staff. You jumped in and took over. It was a power play, and it was unbecoming. I felt the air leave my lungs." "He sent the car to the wrong airport," I said, articulating every syllable. "The governor was going to leave." Elias spoke up, swirling his scotch. "I had it under control, Claudia. I was on the phone with his scheduler. We were working it out. You just panicked. You are too high-strung." My father nodded in agreement. "We have been discussing this," he said. "You seem tired. Claudia, you are holding on too tight. You are micromanaging. It is creating a toxic atmosphere in the house." He walked over to his desk and picked up a paperweight, weighing it in his hand. "We think you need some space," he said. "A sabbatical. We need fresh air in this administration. Elias has a modern vision, and your presence is suffocating it." He did not say, "You are fired." He did not have the courage. He used the language of care to mask the act of amputation. I looked at them. I looked at the parents I had saved, and the usurper they had chosen. I realized then that this was not a reaction to the lunch. The lunch was just the catalyst. This had been the plan all along. They wanted me gone because I was the mirror that showed them their own flaws. Elias was the mirror that showed them their fantasies. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not list the 1,000 times I had saved them. "I see," I said quietly. "You might be right. I am tired." My father exhaled, relieved that I was not making a scene. "Good," he said. "Take a few weeks. Go to a spa. We will handle things here." I turned and walked out of the study. I felt lightheaded, not from shock, but from the sudden drop in pressure. The burden was gone. They had taken it from me. I walked straight to my bedroom and locked the door. I pulled out my burner phone, a device I had purchased with cash 2 days ago. I dialed a number I had memorized but never used. It rang 3 times. "Samantha West." A sharp, smoky voice answered. "Samantha, it is Claudia Pennington." I said. There was a pause on the other end. Samantha West was the shark you called when you wanted to leave nothing but bones in the water. She was the most feared family law attorney in Connecticut, and we had been roommates in college for 1 semester before she dropped out to pursue law with a vengeance. "Claudia," she said, her voice dropping an octave, "I was wondering when you would call. I heard your father hired a new estate manager, a kid with a trust fund and no resume. You heard correctly." I said, "What do you need?" she asked. I looked at the hard drive sitting on my desk, glowing with the blue light of a completed backup. "I need to prepare for a hostile separation." I said, "They are going to try to push me out with nothing. They think I am just a daughter." Samantha laughed, a dry, sharp sound. "Big mistake," she said. "When can we meet tonight?" I said, "I am bringing the files." I hung up the phone. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the window panes of the mansion I had kept standing for 21 years. Let it rattle. I was done holding up the walls. It was time to see if the foundation could stand on its own. The isolation began with the silent click of a digital lock. 3 days after the disastrous lunch with the governor, I woke up to find that my world had been shrunk. I reached for my phone to check the daily liquidity report, a habit ingrained in me over 7,000 mornings, only to find the application grayed out. A small pop-up window informed me that my administrator privileges had been revoked by the system owner. I tried the security app to check the perimeter cameras. Access denied. I tried the household expense account to approve the weekly grocery order. Access denied. It was a digital siege. They were cutting off my limbs one by one, hoping I would not notice until I was a torso rolling on the floor. I did not storm into the breakfast room to demand answers. I knew exactly what this was. It was the pre-termination phase, the period where corporate IT locks down the employee's access before HR calls them into the conference room. My parents were treating their daughter like a rogue traitor. The first physical confrontation came from my mother, Eleanor. She knocked on my bedroom door at 10 in the morning, which was unprecedented. Eleanor usually communicated via intercom or passive-aggressive notes left on the kitchen counter. She entered without waiting for an answer. She looked brittle, her makeup applied a little too heavily, hiding the strain of the deception she was participating in. She held a cup of tea, but her hands were shaking slightly. "Claudia," she said, not looking me in the eye, "we are streamlining the record-keeping. Elias wants to digitize everything. He says paper is a liability." I sat at my vanity, brushing my hair. I watched her in the mirror. "That sounds efficient," I said, my voice neutral. "Yes," she continued, walking around the room, touching things nervously. "He needs the ledger, the manual one. You know the one I mean." My heart slowed down, beating with a heavy, deliberate rhythm. She meant the black ledger. It was not actually black. It was a series of navy blue moleskin notebooks that I had kept since 2006, while the official accounts showed the clean, sanitized version of the sterling fortune. The black ledger contained the truth. It recorded the hush money paid to the maid my father assaulted in 2010. It listed the bribes disguised as consulting fees paid to the zoning board members. It detailed the cash withdrawals used to cover my mother's gambling debts in Atlantic City. It was the map of where the bodies were buried. I turned on the stool to face her. "The transaction logs," I asked innocently. "I can upload those." "No," she snapped, her patience fraying. "The handwritten notes, the personal log. Elias says we need to destroy them. For security, he wants to wipe the slate clean. Of course." I stood up and walked to my bookshelf. I pulled out a thick, leather-bound notebook. It looked old. It felt heavy. "Here it is," I said, handing it to her. Eleanor took it, clutching it to her chest like a shield. She looked relieved, almost giddy. "Thank you, Claudia," she said, backing out of the room. "It is just for the best. We need to protect the family." She left, closing the door behind her. I waited 5 seconds. Then I walked to the window and looked out at the manicured lawn. The notebook I had given her was a forgery. I had anticipated this moment for 3 years. The notebook she held contained valid-looking but ultimately harmless data. It had records of expensive dinners and jewelry purchases embarrassing, perhaps giving the impression of excess, but not illegal. It was a decoy. The real black ledger, 20 years of felonies and moral turpitude, was currently sitting in a safety deposit box at a credit union in New Jersey. Under a name that did not exist in any Sterling family database, they thought they were disarming me. In reality, they had just taken a water pistol and left me with the nuclear codes. The summons came 2 hours later. My phone rang. It was Mr. Myers. Arthur Myers was the family attorney, a man who had survived 4 decades in Connecticut law by having the moral flexibility of a gymnast. He had a voice like grinding gravel and a smile that never touched his eyes. "Claudia," he rasped, "could you come down to my office in Stamford? Your parents and I need to have a chat. Not hello, not how are you? Just the summons. Is everything all right?" "Arthur," I asked, playing the role of the concerned daughter. "Just a standard review," he said. 2 o'clock. Don't be late." I dressed for the execution. I wore a sharp navy blazer, tailored trousers, and heels that clicked with authority on the marble floor. I did not wear jewelry. I wanted to look like what I was, a professional facing a board of directors. I drove myself to Stamford. When I arrived at Myers's office, the receptionist did not offer me coffee. She looked at me with the pity one reserves for a dog being taken to the vet to be put down. "Mr. Myers is ready for you," she said softly. I walked into the conference room. It was a large room dominated by a long oval table. My parents were there, sitting on one side. Richard looked at the wall. Eleanor looked at her hands. Elias was not there, which was telling. They wanted to keep their hands clean. but they didn't have the stomach to let the new guy wield the knife. Mr. Myers sat at the head of the table. He gestured to the single chair on the opposite side. Sit down, Claudia. I sat. The distance between us felt like a canyon. We have been reviewing the estate's trajectory, Myers began. Opening a file folder, he did not look at me. He looked at the papers. And the consensus is that the current management structure is no longer sustainable. He paused, waiting for me to react. I did not. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, my face a mask of polite interest. Your parents feel, and I agree, that the dynamic has become unhealthy. Myers continued, there is a sense of stagnation. The estate requires a more aggressive, modern approach. Elias has presented a strategy that aligns better with the market realities. He looked up then, locking eyes with me. To put it plainly, Claudia, your role as the estate manager is being eliminated. We are restructuring. I looked at my father. Dad, I said softly. He flinched. He finally looked at me, his eyes wet with a mixture of guilt and self-righteousness. It is for your own good. Claudia, he said, his voice weak. You have sacrificed too much. You have no life. No husband, no children. We want you to be free, free, I repeated. We are not throwing you out, my mother added hurriedly, her voice shrill. We are giving you a fresh start. Myers slid a document across the table. It was thick, stapled in the corner. This is a separation and release agreement, Myers said. It outlines the terms of your departure. I looked down at the paper. The words swam before my eyes, but I forced them into focus. Clause 4. Termination of residency. The undersigned agrees to vacate the premises of Sterling Manor within 30 days. Clause 6. Financial settlement. In recognition of past services, the estate agrees to pay a one-time ex gratia payment of $50,000 for 21 years. That broke down to about $2,380 a year, or roughly $6.50 a day. That was the value they placed on my life. That was the price of saving them from bankruptcy, prison, and public ruin. I read further. Clause 8, Waiver of Claims. The undersigned waives any right to future inheritance, trust distributions, or claims against the estate in exchange for the payment mentioned above. Clause 9, Admission of performance. The undersigned acknowledges that this termination is due to performance deficiencies, specifically regarding the mismanagement of vendor relationships and failure to adapt to modern financial practices. I felt a cold laugh bubbling up in my throat, but I swallowed it. Mismanagement. They were accusing me of incompetence to justify cutting me out of the will. It was brilliant. It was evil. And it was exactly what I would have advised a client to do if I were a soulless monster like Arthur Myers. I looked up at them. The room was silent. The air conditioning hummed, recycling the stale air of betrayal. Mismanagement, I asked, my voice calm. The estate has grown by 2,000% under my watch. Myers sighed, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. That is a matter of interpretation. Claudia. The Audit Elias Commission shows a pattern of overly conservative investments that cost the family millions in potential opportunity. That is negligence in the eyes of the law. They were gaslighting me with hypothetical profits. If you do not sign, Myers said, his voice dropping to a low growl, we will be forced to file a civil suit for breach of fiduciary duty. We will freeze your personal accounts. We will drag your name through the mud. You will never work in this town, or any town, again. My mother reached out across the table, her hand hovering in the air. Just sign it. Claudia, take the money. Buy a nice apartment in the city, find a man, be happy. I looked at the pen Myers had placed on the document. It was a Mont Blanc. I had bought it for him as a Christmas gift 5 years ago. I reached out and picked up the document. I felt the weight of the paper. I cannot sign this today, I said. Myers stiffened. Why not? It is a standard agreement. It is 30 pages of legalese. Arthur, I said, standing up, I am not a lawyer. I need to review this. I need to understand what I am agreeing to. You have 24 hours. Myers snapped. I need 48. I countered. 30 days to move out. 30 years of history to erase. Surely you can give me 2 days to read my own obituary. My father waved his hand. Let her read it. Arthur. She is right. We are not monsters. Myers looked unhappy, but he nodded. Friday at noon. Claudia, if I do not have a signature by then, we file the suit. I took the document. I did not say goodbye. I turned and walked out of the room, my spine straight, my head held high. I waited until I was in the elevator before I allowed myself to lean against the wall and exhale. They thought they had won. They thought I was walking away to lick my wounds. They thought the $50,000 was an insult that would break me, but they had made a critical error. They had framed this as a business transaction, and in business, you never enter a negotiation without leverage. I drove back to Sterling Manor. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the driveway. The house looked like a fortress, impenetrable and cold. I walked past the staff, who averted their eyes. They knew. The servants always know before anyone else. I went straight to my room. I did not pack. I did not cry. I went to the closet and pulled down the attic ladder. The attic was dusty, filled with the debris of generations, old paintings, broken furniture, boxes of clothes that were out of fashion. I crawled through the gloom until I found it, a battered wooden trunk with brass fittings. It had been my grandmother's. I had used it to store my things when I came back from boarding school at 16. The year the world fell apart. I opened the lid. The smell of cedar and old paper wafted up. Inside were my high school yearbooks, a dried corsage from a prom I never went to, and a stack of textbooks. I dug to the bottom. My fingers brushed against a thick, manila envelope. The adhesive on the flap had yellowed with age. I pulled it out. I sat on the floor of the attic, the dust motes dancing in the beam of my flashlight. I opened the envelope. Inside was a document titled Asset Management and Guardianship Agreement, dated June 12, 2005. It was signed by Richard Sterling, it was signed by Eleanor Vance, and it was signed by me, a minor at the time, but countersigned by a court-appointed notary because of the bankruptcy proceedings. I read the text. I remembered the day I signed it. My father was weeping, terrified of the IRS. My mother was sedated. They needed someone to legally hold the assets as they transferred them to avoid seizure. They needed a guardian. They needed a manager who was not liable for their previous debts. They had made me the manager. I turned to page 5. Clause 17. I traced the words with my finger. In the event that the manager is relieved of duties without just cause, defined herein as criminal negligence or theft proven in a court of law, the manager shall be entitled to a severance package equal to 15% of the appreciation of the total asset value during the term of management, to be paid immediately upon termination, 15% of the appreciation. When I took over, the estate was worth negative $3 million. Today, it was worth roughly $200 million. That meant the appreciation was $203 million, and 15% of that was $30 million. $450,000, plus interest. They had forgotten. They were so focused on the fake black ledger, so focused on the new will, so focused on Elias's buzzwords, that they had forgotten the desperate, ironclad contract they had signed when they were on their knees begging a 16-year-old girl to save them. I closed the folder. I smiled in the darkness. They wanted to restructure fine. We would restructure. I stood up. Dusting off my knees, I took the envelope and climbed down the ladder. I had 40 hours left until the deadline. That was plenty of time to sharpen the blade. The yellowed paper on my desk felt brittle, like dried skin. It smelled of mildew and the specific, dusty scent of 1999 archival ink. I sat cross-legged on the floor of my bedroom, surrounded by the silence of a house that had actively turned against me, and I read the document for the 4th time. It was titled The Asset Management and Guardianship Agreement. To the uninitiated, it looked like standard legal boilerplate, the kind of dense, impenetrable text that lawyers churn out to justify their billable hours. But to me, Reading it under the harsh light of my desk lamp at 3 in the morning, it was poetry. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. My mind drifted back to the day I signed it. I was 16 years old. The air in the study had been thick with cigar smoke and desperation. My father, Richard, was pacing the rug, wearing a suit that looked like he had slept in it. My mother was sitting in the corner, clutching a handkerchief, weeping about how she could not possibly live in a condo. They were facing an audit that threatened to strip them of everything. The family lawyer at the time, a man named Henderson, who was far more competent and far more expensive than Arthur Myers, had proposed a solution. It was a complex shell game. To protect the core assets, the manor, the land, the grandfathered stocks from being seized to pay off my father's bad debts, they needed to transfer operational control to an independent entity, a trustee, but they did not trust banks. They did not trust strangers. So they looked at me, the quiet, straight-A student who balanced her own checkbook. "We will make Claudia the manager," Henderson had said. "We will emancipate her legally for the purpose of this trust. She will hold the operational rights. It shields the assets from your personal liability." Richard, my parents had agreed without hesitation. They did not see me as a person. They saw me as a safe deposit box with a heartbeat. They made me sign page after page, telling me it was just a formality to save the family. They thought the document was a shield for them. They never imagined it would become a sword for me. I traced my finger down to Clause 5, Section B. Definition of role. The individual designated herein, Claudia Pennington, shall be referred to as the authorized manager. This role is distinct and separate from any familial relationship. The manager is an employee of the trust, subject to all rights and protections governed by the labor laws of the state of Connecticut. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. They had legally defined me as an employee, not a daughter helping out, an employee. This was crucial. If I were just a daughter, my 21 years of labor could be dismissed as familial obligation. Courts rarely awarded back pay for doing chores, no matter how complex those chores were. But an authorized manager, that was a job title, that came with rights. I moved to Clause 12 compensation structure. It read, "The manager shall accrue a base salary commensurate with the industry standard for a chief executive officer of a mid-sized holding company. Deferred until the trust reaches a liquidity event or until the termination of the manager's contract. Deferred salary for 21 years. I had worked for free. I had taken a small allowance for clothes and basic needs, thinking I was contributing to the family pot. But according to this contract, my salary hadn't been zero. It had been accumulating. It was a debt the estate owed me. I did a quick mental calculation. The industry standard for a CEO managing a portfolio of this size was at least $300,000 a year, multiplied by 21 years. That was over $6 million right there, before we even calculated interest. But the real weapon, the nuclear option, was buried on page 8, Clause 17, termination without cause. I read it aloud, my voice whispering in the empty room. In the event that the authorized manager is terminated or relieved of duties without just cause defined as a criminal conviction related to fraud or theft, the manager shall be entitled to a performance severance. This severance shall be calculated as 15% of the total appreciation of the assets under management during the tenure of the manager. 15% of the appreciation. I grabbed a notebook and a calculator. When I took over in 2005, the Sterling estate was technically insolvent, but the base assets, the house, the land, the frozen portfolios were valued at roughly $10 million. However, they were leveraged to the hilt. Today, after my restructuring, my investments, and my aggressive management, the clear valuation of the Sterling Empire was $200 million. The math was simple, but the result was staggering. 200 million minus 10 million equaled $190 million in appreciation. 15% of $190 million. My fingers trembled as I punched the numbers in. $28,500,000. I stared at the screen. If they fired me, They owed me nearly $30 million, plus the $6 million in back pay, plus interest. It was not just a severance package, it was a bankruptcy event for them. They did not have $30 million in cash. They would have to sell the manor. They would have to sell the yacht. They would have to sell everything. They had handed me this contract because they were greedy. They wanted to avoid paying taxes on my salary, so they deferred it. They wanted to incentivize me to grow the fortune, so they added the percentage clause, thinking they would never actually have to pay it, because I was their daughter and I would never leave. They had bet on my loyalty. They had bet on my submission. They had lost the bet. I barely slept. At 8 o'clock the next morning, I walked out of the house. The hallway was quiet. I passed the dining room and saw Elias eating breakfast alone. Scrolling on his phone, he did not look up. He had already dismissed me as a non-entity. I drove into the city to meet Samantha West. Samantha's office was a reflection of her personality, sharp, modern, and intimidating. It was all glass and chrome, overlooking the skyline. She was waiting for me, a cup of black coffee in her hand. I placed the envelope on her desk. "Read this," I said. Samantha opened it. She adjusted her glasses. She began to read. I watched her face. For the first 5 minutes, she was impassive. Then, her eyebrows lifted. Then, she let out a low whistle. Finally, she looked up at me, a wicked grin spreading across her face. "Claudia," she said, tapping the paper, "where did you find this?" "In the attic," I said. "They forgot it existed." Samantha laughed. It was a joyous sound. Of course they did. She said, "Rich people always forget the paperwork they sign when they are scared. They only remember the paperwork they sign when they are greedy." She flipped to the back page. "This is ironclad. Claudia, it was notarized. It was filed with the county clerk. I can see the stamp here. This is not a family dispute. This is a commercial breach of contract." She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. "Myers is trying to frame this as a daughter being cut off from an allowance," she explained. "He wants to keep it in family court, where judges focus on fairness and needs. But this document moves the venue. This belongs in civil court. This is a contract dispute between a C-level executive and a corporation, and the damages are liquidated." She pulled out a legal pad and started writing furiously. "We are not going to negotiate for a better allowance," Samantha said. "We are going to demand full performance of the contract. We are going to hit them with a demand letter that will make Arthur Myers have a stroke." She looked at me. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. "Once we fire this bullet, there is no going back. They will hate you. They will say terrible things about you in the press. They already do." I said, my voice steady. "They told me I was useless. They told me I was a bad manager. I'm just going to prove that I am a very expensive manager." Samantha nodded. "Good. Go home. Do not say a word. Let them think you are beaten. Let the deadline approach. We will file this at the 11th hour." I drove back to Sterling Manor feeling a strange sense of calm. The fear was gone. The hurt was gone. All that was left was the cold precision of the execution. When I entered the house, the atmosphere had shifted from indifferent to hostile. I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. The chef, a man I had hired 10 years ago and whose mortgage I had helped refinance, turned his back on me. "I am sorry, Miss Claudia," he said to the stove. "Mr. Thorne gave instructions. The kitchen is closed to non-residents." Non-residents. I looked at the counter. There was a plate of freshly baked scones. "I see," I said. I did not argue. I did not beg. I walked to the refrigerator, took a bottle of sparkling water, and walked out. He did not stop me, but the tension was palpable. I went up to my room. The bed had not been made. The towels in the bathroom were damp on the floor. The housekeeping staff had been ordered to boycott my quarters. It was petty. It was childish. It was exactly the kind of psychological warfare my mother excelled at. She wanted me to feel dirty, hungry, and unwelcome so that I would sign their papers just to escape. I sat on the edge of my unmade bed and drank my water. Then I heard a noise from down the hall. Thumping. Voices. I opened my door. 2 movers were carrying a large, gaudy leather sofa into my office. Elias was directing them. "Careful with that," he shouted. "That is Italian leather." He turned and saw me. He did not look embarrassed. He looked triumphant, just moving some things in. "Claudia," he said, smoothing his hair, "since you will be vacating soon, I thought I would get a head start on the redecorating. No offense. But your taste is a little sterile. We need some energy in here." I looked at the sofa. It was hideous. It looked like something a fraternity brother would buy if he won the lottery. I looked past him into the office. He had already taken down my diplomas. He had removed the framed architectural drawings of the estate expansion I had overseen. In their place, he had hung a series of abstract paintings that looked like spilled paint. He was erasing me. "Move the desk to the window." Elias commanded the movers. "I want to see the view while I make deals." He looked back at me, waiting for a reaction. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to fight him for the territory so he could call security and have me removed for causing a disturbance. I looked him in the eye. He was 28 years old. He had never balanced a budget in his life. He had no idea that the view he wanted to look at was of a retaining wall that needed structural reinforcement next spring. A project I had already budgeted for, but which he would undoubtedly cancel to save money for his crypto investments. He was a child playing in the cockpit of a jet he did not know how to fly. And I had just found the eject button. A smile touched my lips. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of a predator who realizes the prey has trapped itself in a corner. "You are right, Elias," I said softly. He blinked, surprised. Yes," I said. "The room does need new energy. Enjoy the view." I turned and walked back into my room, closing the door gently. I sat down at my desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. I began to draft my schedule for the next 48 hours, pack personal items, secure digital keys, wait for Friday. I looked at the yellowed contract one last time before slipping it into my bag. Clause 17. It was no longer just a paragraph. It was my vindication. Let them have the office. Let them have the bad sofa. Let them have the chef and the maid and the social validation. I had the 15%, and soon, they would realize that 15% of an empire costs a lot more than a daughter's love. The sun went down, casting the room into darkness. I did not turn on the light. I sat in the dark, listening to the sounds of Elias rearranging my furniture, and for the first time in weeks, I felt completely and utterly at peace. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was wait for them to step into it. The invitation said 7 o'clock, black tie, Sterling Manor. It was my father's 65th birthday, a milestone that in our world required not just a cake, but a coronation. I had spent the last 48 hours ensuring that coronation would go flawlessly. Despite the fact that I had been technically stripped of my command, I had confirmed the arrival of the vintage Bollinger champagne, double-checked the seating chart to keep the feuding factions of the local zoning board apart, and personally inspected the floral arrangements to ensure there were no lilies, which made my mother sneeze. I did this not because I was servile, but because excellence is a habit that cannot be broken by a mere eviction notice. However, when I descended the grand staircase that evening, wearing a gown I had bought for myself 3 years ago, I realized the landscape had shifted beneath my feet. The place cards had been rearranged. For 20 years, I had sat at the right hand of my father. It was the seat of the heir, the executor, the second in command. Tonight, that seat was occupied by Elias Thorne. I scanned the room, my stomach tightening into a cold, hard knot. I found my name card. It was at table 19. It was placed next to the kitchen doors, sandwiched between my great-aunt Mildred, who was deaf and refused to wear her hearing aids, and a junior associate from Mr. Myers' law firm who looked terrified to be there. It was a deliberate, architectural insult. They were not just moving me, they were demoting me publicly. They were signaling to the 200 assembled guests, senators, hedge fund managers, and old money matriarchs that Claudia Pennington was no longer relevant. I walked to table 19 with my head high. I sat down. I unfolded my napkin. I did not look at the head table. where Elias was laughing too loudly at a joke the mayor had just told. The dinner was an exercise in endurance. The waiters, men and women I had hired and trained, could not meet my eyes as they served the soup. They knew. The silence from the staff was the loudest sound in the room. Then came the speeches. My father stood up. The room went silent. He looked regal in his tuxedo. The very image of the benevolent patriarch. He held his glass up, the light catching the crystal. Friends, family, distinguished guests. He began, his voice booming with practiced warmth. Reaching 65 makes a man reflect on his legacy. It makes one think about the future. He paused for effect. He looked down at Elias, beaming with a pride that felt performative and desperate. For years, I have carried the weight of the sterling name. He continued, but a king cannot rule forever. He needs a successor who understands the modern world, a successor with vision, with energy. He placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. I am proud to announce that, effective immediately, Elias Thorne will be assuming the role of managing director of the Sterling Family Trust. There was applause, polite, confused applause. The guests exchanged glances. They all knew Elias was a newcomer. They all knew I had been the one running the show since the Bush administration. My father raised a hand to quiet the room. And as for my daughter, Claudia, he said, turning his gaze toward table 19, the spotlight followed him, pinning me in its glare. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my face frozen in a mask of polite interest. Claudia has worked tirelessly, my father said, choosing the word as if it were a synonym for burdensomely, but we have realized that in her devotion to this family, she has neglected herself. She has sacrificed her own life, and as her father, I cannot allow that to continue. He smiled a sad, benevolent smile. Claudia will be taking an indefinite sabbatical to focus on finding her own happiness. She needs to rest. She needs to find a life outside of these walls. We want her to find a husband, start a family, and finally enjoy the fruits of her labor without the stress of management. The room let out a collective awe of sympathy. It was masterful. It was monstrous. He had just framed my firing as an act of paternal mercy. He had painted me as the tired, lonely spinster who had burned out and needed to be put out to pasture. He had stripped me of my competence and replaced it with a narrative of pity. I felt the eyes of the room on me. The women looked at me with that devastating, patronizing sympathy. Poor Claudia. Couldn't hack it. Needs to go find a man. Elias looked at me across the room. He raised his glass. His expression was not sympathetic. It was smug. It was the look of a thief who has successfully driven the getaway car out of the garage. I did not look away. I did not cry. I reached into my clutch bag and touched the cool metal of my phone. The voice recorder app was running. Every word of that speech, every inflection of his condescension, was being preserved. My mother, Eleanor, stood up and made her way over to my table during the applause. She leaned down, pretending to kiss my cheek. Her perfume was overpowering, a scent of gardenias and betrayal. Smile, Claudia, she hissed in my ear. Stop looking so stiff. You are embarrassing us. I turned to look at her. I am embarrassing you, I whispered back. You just announced to the state of Connecticut that I am a charity case. Sign the papers, Eleanor whispered, her voice like a razor blade wrapped in silk. Sign the waiver and leave with some dignity. If you fight this, everyone will know you were fired for incompetence. Do you want that? Do you want to be the laughingstock of the club? I looked at her. I looked at the woman whose gambling debts I had paid off 3 times. I looked at the woman whose reputation I had scrubbed clean more times than I could count. I will not sign. Mother, I said calmly. She pulled back, her eyes narrowing. Then you are on your own, she said. She walked away, her hips swaying, returning to the head table to bask in the admiration of people she secretly despised. I took a sip of water. The ice rattled against the glass. I was alone in a room full of people, but I had never felt stronger. They had played their ace card public humiliation. They thought shame would break me, but they forgot that I knew where the skeletons were buried because I was the one who dug the graves. Then, the universe decided to intervene, or rather, the consequences of Elias's optimization decided to intervene. The dinner was held in the Great Hall, a cavernous space lined with the family's art collection. The pièce de résistance was a large, 19th-century oil painting by a renowned French impressionist. Valued at $4 million, it hung on the east wall, directly behind the head table. I had noticed it earlier. The room felt humid, sticky. I had tried to check the climate control app on my phone, but my access was blocked. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the hall. The music stopped. The conversation died. We all turned to look. The ornate plaster molding above the painting had given way. A chunk of wet, heavy drywall fell, striking the top of the gilded frame. But that was not the worst part. Water was dripping. A steady, rhythmic drip of condensation was falling directly from the HVAC vent above, splashing onto the canvas of the $4 million masterpiece. The water was running down the oil paint, streaking the vibrant blues and greens. My mother screamed. My painting, she shrieked. "Do something!" Elias jumped up, looking panicked. He grabbed a linen napkin and ran toward the painting, looking like he intended to dab at the dissolving art. "Do not touch it!" I shouted from table 19. "You will smear the pigment." Elias froze. The guests were murmuring. The humidity in the room was palpable now, a thick, tropical heaviness that had no business being in a climate-controlled gallery. My father turned on Elias. "What is happening? Why is the system leaking?" Elias stammered, his face turning red. "I don't know. The maintenance crew said it was fine." My father turned his rage toward the safest target. He looked across the room at me. "Claudia," he bellowed, "you were in charge of the facilities. Did you not service the units?" The room turned to me. The accusation hung in the air. They were going to pin this on me. They were going to use this public disaster to justify the mismanagement clause in the termination letter. I stood up. I smoothed the silk of my dress. I picked up my clutch. I walked slowly, deliberately, toward the head table. The crowd parted for me. I stopped 10 feet away from my father and Elias. "I am not in charge of facilities." "Richard," I said, my voice projecting clearly to the back of the room without shouting. "I was removed from that role 2 weeks ago." My father's face purpled. "You are still responsible for the handover. You neglected this." I reached into my bag. I did not pull out a handkerchief to weep into. I pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Actually," I said, holding the paper up, "this is a printout of an email I sent to Elias Thorne on January 10th. 3 weeks ago." I unfolded it. Subject urgent. HV. AC. Maintenance and insurance renewal for art gallery. I read aloud, my voice steady. "Elias, the contract with Climate Tech Specialists is due for renewal. The humidity sensors in the Great Hall are showing drift. If they are not calibrated and the condensation pumps are not serviced by the 15th, we risk catastrophic failure during a high-occupancy event. Additionally, the insurance policy on the French Impressionist collection requires proof of maintenance to remain valid. Please approve the attached invoice for $12,000 immediately." I lowered the paper and looked at Elias. He was pale, sweat beading on his upper lip. "And here is your reply, dated January 11th. I continued. "Claudia, stop obsessing over details. $12,000 is a ripoff. I am canceling the contract. I have a guy who can do it for $500. We need to cut the fat." I let the silence stretch. It was heavy, suffocating, and delicious. "You cut the fat." "Elias," I said, "and now you have dissolved a $4 million asset. And since you canceled the vendor contract, the insurance company will deny the claim for negligence." I dropped the paper on the table in front of my father. It landed next to his untouched birthday cake. "Happy birthday." "Dad," I said. I turned around. I could feel their eyes burning into my back. I could feel my mother's shock, my father's fury, and Elias's total destruction. I did not run. I walked. I walked past the senators and the bankers. I walked past the smirking zoning board members who now looked stunned. I walked out of the Great Hall, through the foyer, and out the front door into the cool night air. I checked my phone. The recording was saved. I had walked in there as a victim. I had walked out as a witness for the prosecution. They wanted to shame me. They wanted to make me small. Instead, they had given me the final piece of evidence I needed to bury them. I got into my car. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the kill. I looked back at the house one last time. The lights were still on, but the party was over. I drove away. The road ahead was dark, but for the first time in 21 years, I was the one holding the steering wheel. The morning sun hit the windows of Sterling Manor with a brightness that felt offensive. The house was quiet, but it was the silence of a held breath, not of peace. The wreckage of the previous night, the water-damaged masterpiece, the humiliated guests, the shattered illusion of perfection had been swept away by the cleaning crew before dawn. But the smell of disaster still lingered in the hallways. I was in my room, packing, not because I had agreed to leave, but because I knew that whatever happened next, I would not be sleeping under this roof another night. I was folding a silk blouse when the summons came. It was not a polite knock. It was the heavy, authoritative rap of knuckles against wood that demanded, rather than requested, entry. I opened the door. Arthur Myers stood there, flanked by my parents. My father, Richard, looked haggard, his eyes bloodshot, likely from a night spent screaming at Elias and drinking scotch. My mother, Eleanor, refused to look at me, focusing her gaze on a spot on the carpet near my left foot. "We need to finish this," Myers said. "Downstairs, now." I did not ask for time to brush my hair or change out of my casual slacks. I simply nodded, grabbed my phone, and followed them down the grand staircase. We marched like a funeral procession, but it was unclear whose body was in the casket. They led me to the morning room, a space usually reserved for light breakfasts and reading the newspaper. Today, the round table was covered with legal files. Elias was not there. He was likely hiding, nursing his wounded ego and letting the adults clean up the mess he had created. I sat down. Myers did not sit. He paced, a shark in a pinstripe suit. "Last night was unfortunate," Myers began, his voice devoid of any real sympathy. "But it clarifies the situation. The relationship between you and this family has become toxic. It is untenable." I looked at my father. "Unfortunate?" I asked. "I believe the word you're looking for is negligent. Elias destroyed a $4 million asset." Richard slammed his hand on the table. The china teacups rattled. "Enough," he shouted. "I am done with the finger-pointing. Claudia, you humiliated us. You humiliated your brother." "He is not my brother," I said calmly. "He is your son. There is a difference." Richard's face tightened. "This ends today," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "We are done negotiating." Myers stepped forward and slid a single document across the polished wood of the table. It was thinner than the previous one. It looked final. "This is the final settlement and termination of rights," Myers said. "It is a take-it-or-leave-it offer." I picked it up. I scanned the terms. It was brutal. It was designed not just to dismiss me, but to erase me. Clause 1, immediate vacation. I had to leave the premises by 5 o'clock that afternoon. Clause 2. Financial settlement. The offer was $50,000, not a penny more. Clause 3, asset transfer. I was to be given title to a 2018 sedan currently used by the housekeeping staff for grocery runs. Clause 4, non-disclosure agreement. This was the longest section. It barred me from speaking to the press, posting on social media, or discussing the internal financial workings of the Sterling family with any third party, under penalty of a $5 million lawsuit per infraction. I looked up. $50,000. I repeated, and a used car. For 21 years of service. It is a generous gift, my mother said, her voice thin and wavering. Considering the damage you have caused. I laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound, and if I refuse, I asked, if I decide to let a judge decide what 21 years of my life is worth. Myers stopped pacing. He leaned down, placing his hands on the table, invading my personal space. Then we go to the police. Claudia. I raised an eyebrow. The police? For what? Being too competent? For embezzlement, Myers said. The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. I stared at him. Excuse me, Elias has been doing a forensic audit, Myers said, his eyes gleaming with malice. He found irregularities, invoices from vendors that do not exist, payments routed to accounts that seem to be controlled by you, roughly $200,000 over the last 5 years. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. It was a fabrication, a clumsy, desperate lie. Elias had likely created fake invoices himself in the last 48 hours to cover his own spending or simply to frame me. You know that is a lie, I said, looking directly at my father. You know I have never taken a dime that wasn't authorized. I know that the paper trail looks bad. Richard said, looking away. If Myers takes this to the district attorney, you will be facing felony charges. You will go to prison, Claudia. Or at the very least, your reputation will be destroyed. You will never work in finance again. This was it, the shakedown. This was constructive dismissal, weaponized with the threat of criminal prosecution. They were not just firing me, they were holding a gun to my head. Sign the agreement, take the $50,000, and leave quietly. Myers urged, and the evidence of embezzlement disappears. We bury it. We protect the family name. I looked at them, really looked at them. I saw the fear in my mother's eyes. She knew this was wrong, but she was too terrified of losing her lifestyle to speak up. I saw the hardness in my father's face. He had convinced himself that I was the enemy, that destroying me was necessary to save his ego. They were willing to send me to jail on false charges just to make room for Elias. I felt something break inside me. It wasn't my heart. It was the last tether of obligation. The final thread of guilt that had kept me bound to this house for 2 decades snapped. I placed the document down on the table. I folded my hands. I want to be clear, I said, my voice steady. I want to hear you say it. Say what Richard snapped. Is this the final decision? I asked. Are you firing me? Not as a daughter, but as an employee. Richard looked at me with disdain. You are not an employee, Claudia. You are family. That is why this is so hard. No, I cut him off. Family does not threaten family with jail. Family does not offer severance packages. This is a transaction. I leaned forward. Are you terminating my position because I am no longer useful to the business of this family? Richard exhaled. A long, impatient breath. He stood up and buttoned his jacket. Fine, he said coldly. Yes, this is business. Claudia, we are restructuring. You are redundant. You are too expensive emotionally, and you are blocking the new direction. You have no utility left for us. It is a business decision. It is business. Those 3 words were the key. He had just verbally confirmed the nature of our relationship. He had stripped away the protection of family and entered the arena of commerce. And in commerce, contracts matter. I nodded slowly. Okay, I said. Myers blinked. He had expected screaming. He had expected begging. Okay, he repeated. I agree. I said, if this is business, then I accept the termination. I will resign from my position as manager of the Sterling estate. I reached for the pen Myers was holding. However, I said, pulling my hand back, I cannot sign this specific document. It is poorly drafted and factually inaccurate. What? Myers sputtered. This is a standard release. I stood up. I smoothed my slacks. I will leave, I said. I will vacate the premises, and I will sign a resignation letter formally stepping down from all management duties. But I will draft it myself, to ensure it is legally precise. My father looked suspicious. What game are you playing? No game, I said. You want me gone? I am agreeing to go. I just want to make sure the paperwork is correct so there are no loose ends. You said it yourself. Dad, it is business. I looked at Myers. Give me 24 hours. I will have a formal resignation letter on your desk by tomorrow morning. It will confirm my departure and my acceptance of the termination of my role. Myers narrowed his eyes. He was trying to find the trap, but he was looking in the wrong place. He thought I was trying to negotiate for more money in the settlement. He did not know about the 1999 agreement. 24 hours, Myers said slowly. But the offer remains the same, $50,000. And the car? I smiled. It was a small, tight smile. I understand the terms perfectly, I said. My father waved his hand dismissively. Fine, 24 hours. But tomorrow morning, you are out. And if you try anything funny, the embezzlement file goes to the police. I am not laughing. Richard, I said. I turned and walked out of the morning room. I could hear them exhaling behind me. I could hear the clink of china as my mother finally took a sip of her tea. They thought they had won. They thought they had bullied me into submission. They thought I was going upstairs to cry and pack my bags and accept their crumbs. They had no idea. The clock began ticking the moment I walked out of the morning room with my 24-hour reprieve. My parents and their shark of a lawyer believed I was using this time to grieve, to panic, or perhaps to scramble for a way to beg for my job back. They imagined a daughter in distress. What they failed to realize was that they had not granted me 24 hours of mercy. They had granted me 24 hours of tactical preparation. I drove straight to the nearest secure location, which was not my bedroom, but a quiet, glass-walled conference room in Samantha West's law firm in downtown Stamford. We did not waste time with pleasantries. We ordered black coffee and laid the yellowed 1999 contract on the table between us like a holy relic. We need a resignation letter that functions as a trigger mechanism. Samantha said, uncapping a fountain pen, it needs to be short enough that they do not bore of reading it, but specific enough that it constitutes a binding legal acceptance of the contract terms. We spent 3 hours drafting 3 sentences. In the world of high-stakes litigation, brevity is the most expensive commodity. A long letter invites debate. A short letter invites assumption. We wanted them to assume. The final draft sat before us. Printed on crisp, watermarked cotton paper, it looked harmless. It looked submissive. It read, I, Claudia Pennington, hereby formally resign from all management and administrative positions within the Sterling Family Trust and associated entities. Effective immediately. This resignation is tendered in compliance with the involuntary termination of my role as verbally communicated by the trustees on February 2nd, 2026, and is subject to the full and immediate settlement of all outstanding financial obligations pursuant to the Asset Management and Guardianship Agreement of 2005 and applicable state labor laws. Samantha tapped the date with her fingernail. That is the hook, she said, her eyes gleaming. The agreement of 2005. To them, it is just a reference to your start date. They will think you are just being pedantic about your tenure. They have forgotten that the agreement contains Clause 17. They will not read it carefully, I said, staring at the words. Myers is too arrogant. He thinks he wrote the rules of this game. He will see the word resignation and the phrase subject to settlement and assume I am talking about the $50,000 and the used Kia. Exactly, Samantha grinned, and by countersigning this to accept your resignation, they are legally acknowledging that the 2005 agreement is the governing document of your separation. They are validating the very contract that hangs them. I folded the letter and placed it in a stiff envelope. The paper felt heavy, loaded with potential energy. I returned to Sterling Manor at 4 p.m. The house was silent, a mausoleum of old money and new betrayals. I went straight to my room, but I did not collapse on the bed. I began the process of extraction. This was not packing. It was an audit. I knew that the moment I left, Elias would try to accuse me of theft. He would count the silverware. He would check the inventory of the wine cellar. He would look for any excuse to drag me back in handcuffs to void my claims. I had to be bulletproof. I took 2 large suitcases from the closet. I opened them on the floor. I adhered to a strict rule if I could not produce a receipt for it. It did not go in the bag. I looked at the closet full of designer clothes, the Chanel blazers, the Prada heels, the silk scarves. Most of them had been purchased with the family credit card, technically business expenses for my role as the face of the estate. I left them. I left the diamond stud earrings my mother gave me for my 30th birthday. I left the gold watch my father gave me when I closed the merger deal 3 years ago. Those were gifts, yes, but in a court of law, They could be argued as company property provided to an employee. I packed only the jeans I bought with my own cash. I packed the t-shirts I ordered online from my personal account. I packed my toiletries. I reached for a silver paperclip on the desk to hold a stack of personal photos together. My hand froze. The paperclip came from the supply closet downstairs. It was purchased with Sterling Trust funds. I put the paperclip back. I wrapped the photos in a rubber band I had found on the sidewalk outside a coffee shop a week ago. It was obsessive, perhaps, but obsession is just another word for survival. By the time I zipped the suitcases shut, they contained nothing but 50 pounds of undeniable innocence. Then, I turned to the computer. This was the most delicate part of the operation. Elias and Myris had accused me of mismanagement. If I wiped the hard drives, they would claim spoliation of evidence. They would say I destroyed the proof of my crimes. I could not delete a single file. However, I was under no obligation to make those files accessible. I sat down at the terminal. I logged in with my administrator credentials one last time. I initiated a full system security update. I changed the root encryption key. For the past 10 years, the password to the Sterling mainframe had been a variation of my mother's maiden name. It was insecure, but it was what they could remember. I changed it to a 64-character string of random alphanumeric gibberish generated by a military-grade security algorithm. I did not write it down. I memorized it. Then, I enabled two-factor authentication. Tied to a physical hardware key, a small USB drive that was currently hanging on my keychain. I was not locking them out to be malicious. I was simply following the strict cybersecurity protocols that the insurance company recommended. If they wanted to access the financial records, the tax returns, or the vendor contracts, they would need to log in. And to log in, they would need me. I left the computer running. The screensaver flickered on a generic image of a calm blue ocean. Behind that peaceful image was a fortress that no one in this house knew how to breach. I slept for 4 hours. It was a dreamless, black sleep. At 8 o'clock the next morning, I showered and dressed in a charcoal gray suit I had purchased at a thrift store in New Haven 4 years ago. It was modest, professional, and entirely mine. I brought my suitcases down to the foyer and left them by the door. I walked into the library. They were all there. My father sat behind the desk, looking impatient. My mother sat on the sofa, looking at a magazine, feigning disinterest. Arthur Myers stood by the window, checking his watch. Elias was perched on the edge of the desk, swinging his leg like a pendulum. "You are cutting it close." Elias sneered. "The movers are coming at noon to turn your room into a gym." I ignored him. I walked to the desk and placed the single sheet of paper in front of my father. "My resignation," I said quietly. Richard picked it up. He adjusted his reading glasses. He read the first line. I saw his eyes scan the words, "formally resign." His shoulders relaxed. That was all he wanted to see. He wanted the surrender. He skimmed the rest. His eyes glided over Agreement of 2005, without a flicker of recognition. To him, dates were just noise. He looked at Myris. "It seems standard," Richard said, sliding the paper to the lawyer. Myers picked it up. This was the moment of danger. Myers was a snake, but he was a literate snake. He read the letter, subject to settlement of outstanding financial obligations. Myers read aloud. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "We have the check right here. Claudia, $50,000. That covers the obligations." I nodded, keeping my face perfectly still. "As long as the obligations are met according to the agreement referenced," I said, my voice flat. Myers smirked. He thought I was being difficult. He thought I was trying to sound like a lawyer to salvage my pride. He did not check his files for a document from 21 years ago. He did not pause to consider that obligations might mean something other than the pittance on the table. He pulled a gold pen from his pocket. "Fine," Myers said. "We accept." He scribbled his signature on the bottom of the page, under the line that said, "Accepted and agreed on behalf of the Sterling Trust." He pushed the paper to my father. "Sign it. Richard, let us get this over with." My father signed. His signature was large, loopy, and confident. It was the signature of a man who thought he was taking out the trash, not realizing he was signing away the deed to the landfill. I took the document. I signed my name below theirs. I pulled the original toward me and folded it. I placed it in my inside jacket pocket, right next to my beating heart. "Now," Myers said, picking up a check from the desk. "Your severance." He held it out. I looked at the check. $50,000. I shook my head. "Keep it," I said. The room went silent. "Excuse me?" Mears asked, his hand freezing in midair. "I do not want your check," I said. "We will settle the accounts later, strictly according to the contract I just cited." Elias laughed, a harsh barking sound. "You are refusing money. You are that arrogant. You are going to walk out of here with nothing just to make a point." I looked at Elias. I looked at the boy who thought he had won a kingdom. "I am walking out of here with everything I need." "Elias," I said. I turned to my parents. "Goodbye, Richard. Goodbye, Eleanor." I did not call them Mom and Dad. Those titles had been dissolved along with my employment. I turned and walked out of the library. I picked up my suitcases in the foyer. The butler, Charles, stepped forward to help me. I stopped him. "No, Charles," I said gently. "I carry my own bags from now on." I walked out the front door. The morning air was crisp and cold. The gravel crunched under my heels, a sound that felt like the breaking of chains. I reached the large iron gates at the end of the driveway. I stepped through the pedestrian exit. I turned back one last time. I saw the silhouette of my father standing in the library window, watching me go. He looked small. I reached into my pocket and touched the folded letter. The ink was still wet, but the verdict was already set in stone. I pulled the gate shut. It closed with a heavy, metallic clang that echoed through the trees. I did not look back. I hailed the taxi I had called to wait for me down the road. "To New York City," I told the driver. He looked at me in the rearview mirror. "You look like you just won the lottery." "Lady," he said. I looked out the window as the Sterling estate disappeared behind the trees. "Better," I said. "I just earned it." I checked into the street. Regis in Manhattan, ordering a pot of tea and a club sandwich. For the first time in 21 years, I did not have to worry about whether the cucumber was sliced to exactly 2 millimeters or if the napkin fold was symmetrical. I sat by the window overlooking Fifth Avenue, my phone resting face down on the table. I did not need to be in Connecticut to see the fire. I had built the house, wired the electricity, and installed the gas lines. I knew exactly when and where the sparks would fly. The collapse did not happen all at once. It was a cascade, a domino effect of incompetence colliding with a system designed for a master operator. It began on day 1, less than 12 hours after I walked out the iron gates. I knew it was happening because my personal security app, which I had not yet disconnected from the main server, pinged softly at midnight. It was a notification I had programmed 5 years ago. Scheduled security rotation initiated. Every 30 days. The master passwords for the Sterling family banking accounts, the investment portfolios, and the digital trust interfaces automatically reset. It was a protocol I had insisted on after a phishing attempt in 2015. The system would generate a new, random 32-character key, which was then sent to the primary administrator's secure device. That device was currently sitting in my purse, back in Connecticut. I imagined the scene. Elias, likely trying to transfer funds to one of his optimization projects, or perhaps just trying to pay for the ugly leather sofa he had ordered, would be staring at a login screen. He would type in the old password, access denied. He would try again, perhaps typing slower, thinking he had made a typo. Access denied. He would call technical support. They would ask for the administrator verification code. He would not have it. He would call the bank. They would ask for the voice authorization of the primary account holder. That was me. I took a sip of my tea. The notification on my phone screen faded, but the satisfaction remained. The liquidity of the Sterling estate had just frozen solid. They were millionaires on paper, but until they broke my encryption, they could not buy a gallon of milk. Day 3 brought the logistical failure. My phone began to buzz with emails from third-party vendors. These were not the high-level bankers. These were the people who actually kept the manor running. The pool cleaners, the landscapers, the gourmet food suppliers, and the waste management company. Subject payment. Overdue. Invoice 4092. Subject service suspension notice. Subject urgent delivery, hold. For 2 decades, I had paid these invoices every Friday morning like clockwork. I used a digital signature key that verified the payments were authorized by the trust. When I resigned, I legally revoked that signature. I read an email from the head of the landscaping firm, a man named Mr. Henderson, who had a short temper and a low tolerance for excuses. Dear Sterling Estate, payment for last month's groundskeeping was declined this morning due to unauthorized signatory. We are suspending all pruning and lawn services until the balance of $4,000 is settled in cash or certified check. I smiled. It was July, in Connecticut. If you stop cutting the grass for 3 days in the humid summer heat, the manicured lawns begin to look shaggy. If you stop treating the pool, the algae blooms within 48 hours. I imagined my mother looking out her bedroom window. She prized her English garden above all else. Seeing the weeds creeping into her prize-winning rose beds would be causing her physical pain, and with the accounts frozen, Elias could not even write a check to fix it. He would have to pay out of his own pocket, and from what I knew of Elias's personal finances, his pockets were mostly filled with lint and ambition. Day 5 was when the real panic set in. I received a notification from a courier service. Package delivered to registered agent. The registered agent for the Sterling Trust was still listed as me, but the physical address was the manor. The sender was the Internal Revenue Service. I knew exactly what that letter contained. It was a notice of audit for the tax year 2023. It was a routine check, something I handled every few years. It required the production of specific receipts, charitable donation logs, and the capital gains amortization schedules. Elias would be holding that letter right now. His hands would be shaking. He would rush to the filing cabinets in the home office. He would tear through the drawers, looking for the files labeled Tax 2023. He would find them empty. He would scream. He would blame me. He would tell my father that I had stolen the records. But I had not stolen anything. I had simply followed the letter of the law. Sensitive tax documents for a corporation of this size are required to be stored in a fireproof, flood-proof facility with redundant security. I kept them at a bonded warehouse in New Jersey, paid for by the trust, under a contract that required my biometric thumbprint to access. The files were safe. They were organized. They were ready for the IRS, but Elias did not know where the warehouse was, and even if he did, the guards would not let him in. He was standing in a room full of empty folders, holding a letter from the most powerful debt collector in the world, with absolutely no way to prove that the family hadn't been laundering money for the last decade. My phone began to ring in earnest now. Dad flashed on the screen. I watched it ring until it went to voicemail. 2 minutes later, Mom, I watched it ring. Then, Elias Thorne. I flipped the phone over. The silence of my hotel room was a luxury I had purchased with 21 years of noise. I was not going to refund it cheaply. Later that afternoon, the digital intrusion attempts began. I was reading a novel, a trashy romance that required zero brainpower. When my laptop pinged, security alert, unauthorized biometric attempt detected, device location Sterling Manor, IP address 192.168.1.10. Elias was trying to log into my workstation. I had left the computer behind, but I had not left it undefended. The system was equipped with a logic bomb I had installed to prevent corporate espionage. If someone attempted to bypass the login screen 3 times, the system would not only lock down, it would interpret the attempt as a hostile hack. I watched the log update in real time on my phone. Attempt 1 failed. Attempt 2 failed. Attempt 3 failed. System status. Lockdown mode engaged. Action taken. Automated report filed with cybersecurity insurance provider. I laughed out loud. By trying to hack my computer to find the passwords he was too incompetent to ask for. Elias had just triggered an automatic fraud alert with the family's insurance carrier. The carrier would now freeze the policy pending an investigation into internal data breach. This meant that if the house burned down tomorrow, they would not see a dime until the investigation was cleared. Elias wasn't just digging a hole, he was drilling through the bedrock. The final blow for the week came via a news alert on my tablet. Vanderbilt Westcott Group pulls out of Connecticut development deal. I clicked the link. It was a short article in the business section. The much-anticipated joint venture between the Sterling Family Trust and the Vanderbilt Westcott Group has been abruptly terminated. Sources close to the deal cite administrative irregularities and a failure to produce necessary compliance documentation by the closing deadline. The deal, valued at $15 million, is considered dead in the water. That was the deal Elias had been bragging about. The deal that was supposed to prove he was the visionary. He had missed the deadline. Of course he had. The compliance documents were on the encrypted drive he couldn't open, and the signature required was the one I had revoked. He had probably tried to bluff them, sending incomplete files or asking for an extension with his trademark arrogance. But real institutional investors do not tolerate arrogance from amateurs. They walked away. $15 million. Gone in a puff of smoke because Elias didn't know the difference between a PDF and a secure certificate. My father, Richard, was not a genius, but he was not entirely senile by now. The reality must have been setting in. He was sitting in a house that was slowly filling with trash, with a garden that was dying, with accounts that were frozen, and with a business reputation that was hemorrhaging value. He had fired the mechanic and was now surprised that the car would not start. He realized now that I was not just the person who drove the car. I was the engine. I was the transmission. I was the spark plugs and the fuel injection system. He had thought he was the driver, but he was just the hood ornament. The phone rang again. This time, the caller ID said, Arthur Myers, Esquire. I let it ring 3 times. Then, I picked it up. This is Claudia, I said, my voice calm and professional. Claudia, Mears barked. He sounded stressed. The smooth, oily cadence was gone, replaced by the frantic tone of a man realizing he might get sued for malpractice. You need to come to the house, immediately. I am afraid that is not possible. Arthur, I said. I am currently in New York. Stop playing games, Myers shouted. The accounts are frozen. The vendors are threatening to sue. The IRS is knocking at the door. Elias cannot access the mainframe. You have locked us out of our own property. I have done no such thing, I said, examining my fingernails. I secured the system according to the standard cybersecurity protocols outlined in the trustee handbook. When I resigned, I surrendered my physical access. The system is simply waiting for an authorized administrator to log in. You are the administrator. Mears yelled. Was, I corrected him. I was the administrator. I resigned. Remember, you witnessed the letter. Give me the passwords. Claudia, Myers demanded. Right now, over the phone, or I will have a judge hold you in contempt. Arthur, you know I cannot do that, I said, my voice dripping with false concern. Giving high-level encryption keys over an unsecured cellular line would be a violation of the trust's security policy. It would void the insurance. You wouldn't want me to act negligently, would you? There was a silence on the other end, a heavy, choking silence. He knew I had him. He knew that I was using his own bureaucratic rules to strangle him. What do you want? Myers asked, his voice lower. Defeated. I don't want anything. Arthur, I said. I am just a former employee enjoying her retirement. Richard is furious, Myers said. He says you are sabotaging the family. Richard fired the only person who knew how to fly the plane, I said cold. The crash is not sabotage. Arthur, it is gravity. Come back, Myers said. Come back and fix it. We can discuss terms. I smiled. They were desperate. It had only been 5 days, and they were already begging, but I wasn't done yet. They hadn't bled enough. "I am afraid I cannot discuss any business matters with you directly," I said. "As I am now a private party engaged in a legal dispute with the trust regarding my severance, all communications must go through my legal representative." "You have got to be kidding me," Myers groaned. "Please write this down," I said. "Samantha West, West & Associates. Her office is on 42nd Street. I am sure you have the number. Claudia." "Goodbye, Arthur," I said. "Good luck with the IRS audit. I hear they are very thorough this year." I hung up the phone. I sat back in the plush hotel chair and looked out at the city lights. The chaos in Connecticut felt a million miles away. I imagined Elias sweating in his expensive suit, my father screaming at the walls, and my mother crying over her wilting roses. The system had collapsed. The trap had snapped shut. Now, it was time to send the bill. The weapon of choice was not a gun, nor was it a public scandal. It was a 20-page document printed on heavy, cream-colored bond paper, stapled once in the top left corner. It was titled, "Demand for Performance and Cure of Breach," but in layman's terms. It was a declaration of war. I sat in Samantha West's office, watching her slide the document into a FedEx envelope. The red urgent sticker looked like a splash of blood. "Are you sure about the number?" I asked. Taking a sip of water, my throat felt dry. Not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of what we were about to do. Samantha tapped the calculator on her desk. "The math is irrefutable. Claudia, we are not pulling numbers out of thin air. We are using the formulas set out in the 2005 agreement, the very agreement they ratified when they countersigned your resignation letter." She began to list the items, counting them off on her fingers. First, unpaid wages. The agreement classified you as an executive manager. The market rate for that role, adjusted for inflation over 21 years, averages $300,000 annually. That is $6 million. $300,000 in base pay. She clicked the pen. Second, overtime. You were on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, under Connecticut labor laws, and given that they failed to pay you the exempt salary, you are entitled to overtime pay for every hour worked over 40. That adds another $4 million. Third, statutory interest. Connecticut allows for 10% annual interest on unpaid wages. Compounded over 2 decades, that is another $9 million. She looked at me, her eyes sharp. And finally, the kill shot. Clause 17. The performance severance. 15% of the asset appreciation. The estate went from $10 million to $200 million. That is a gain of $190 million. 15% of that is $28 million. $500,000. She circled the total at the bottom of the page. Grand total, $47,800,000, due and payable within 10 business days. I looked at the number. It was abstract. It was the GDP of a small island nation. It was also exactly enough to bankrupt the Sterling Trust if they didn't liquidate everything immediately. "Send it," I said. The package arrived at Sterling Manor at 10 o'clock the next morning. I knew it arrived because Samantha's phone rang at 10:15. She put it on speakerphone. "This is extortion," Arthur Myers screamed. His voice was so loud it distorted the speaker. "You are out of your mind. West, I will have you disbarred for this." Samantha leaned back in her chair, checking her cuticles. Her voice was cool, liquid nitrogen against his fire. "Good morning. Arthur, I assume you have received our demand letter. I would hardly call it extortion. It is a simple contract enforcement." "Contract enforcement," Myers sputtered. "You are citing a guardianship paper from 2005. That document is obsolete. It was a formality. It was a binding contract, authorized by the court, and never formally terminated." Samantha corrected him. "In fact, your clients explicitly reaffirmed its validity 2 days ago when they signed Miss Pennington's resignation letter, which conditioned her departure on the settlement of obligations pursuant to that specific agreement. You witnessed it yourself. Arthur, did you not read the document before advising your client to sign?" There was a choking sound on the other end. Myers knew he had messed up. He had committed legal malpractice. He had let his arrogance blind him to the trap I had laid. "We will fight this," Myers roared, trying to regain ground. "We will sue her. We are filing a countersuit this afternoon for corporate sabotage." She locked the accounts. She wiped the servers. She has caused millions of dollars in damages to the estate's operations. I leaned forward toward the phone. I did not wipe anything. "Arthur," I said, my voice calm. "Claudia. Is that you? You ungrateful little—" I secured the system. "Arthur," I interrupted, "as per the cybersecurity protocols required by the insurance policy protocols, I might add, that Elias signed off on without reading last year. The system is simply encrypted. It is waiting for a competent administrator to log in. The fact that you fired the only person who knows the encryption keys is not sabotage. It is a personnel error. You held the keys hostage," Myers shouted. "I left the keys on the desk." I lied smoothly. "Or perhaps I put them in the safe. Or maybe I gave them to Elias and he lost them. Discovery will be interesting. Won't it? I am sure a forensic audit of the IT logs will show that I followed procedure, and that the subsequent lockouts were due to unauthorized access attempts by your new manager." Myers went silent. He knew he couldn't prove sabotage. He knew that incompetence is not a crime he could pin on me. "We are not paying $45 million, Myers said, his voice dropping to a growl. "We will drag this out in court for 10 years. We will bleed you dry in legal fees. You will never see a dime." Samantha smiled. This was the moment she had been waiting for. "We anticipated you might say that, Arthur, which is why we are also preparing to file a motion for discovery." She paused for effect. "If we go to trial, everything becomes public record, and I do mean everything. We will subpoena the bank records. We will subpoena the vendor contracts. And, of course, we will submit into evidence the personal logs kept by the manager during her tenure." I saw the color drain from the conversation. "Even over the phone, the logs?" Myers asked, his voice trembling slightly. "The black ledger." "Arthur," I said softly. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a diamond. "The black ledger. The record of every bribe my father had paid to city council members to get zoning permits. The record of the hush money paid to the cocktail waitress in 2012. The record of my mother's offshore gambling debts being paid via shell companies to avoid tax. If that ledger became public evidence, my father wouldn't just be bankrupt. He would be in federal prison." "You wouldn't," Myers whispered. "They are your parents. They are my former employers." I corrected him. "And in a wage dispute, evidence of financial mismanagement is highly relevant." I let the threat hang there. "You have 48 hours to respond to the demand letter." "Arthur," Samantha said, "if we do not have a settlement offer by Friday at 5 o'clock, we file the complaint, and once it is filed, the ledger becomes Exhibit A." Samantha ended the call. We sat in silence for a moment. "Do you think they will fold?" Samantha asked. I looked out the window at the Manhattan skyline. "They are greedy," I said, "but they are cowards. Greed makes you fight. Cowardice makes you settle. They will fold." Back at Sterling Manor, the atmosphere must have been apocalyptic. I learned later, from the butler Charles, who eventually quit and called me, what happened in the hours following that phone call. My father, Richard, went into a state of shock. He sat in his study, staring at the wall, muttering about how I was a viper he had nursed at his breast. My mother, Eleanor, went the other way. She became hysterical. She screamed that she would not go to jail, that she could not wear orange, that I was trying to kill her. But the most satisfying reaction came from Elias Thorne. Elias, the visionary, the disruptor, the son my father had always wanted. When Myers explained the situation to them, that the estate was facing a $47 million liability and that the legacy was effectively underwater, Elias did the math. He realized there was no inheritance left. He realized that even if they won, the legal fees and the taxes and the inevitable fire sale of assets would leave the Sterling Trust worth nothing. And Elias Thorne did not do nothing, according to Charles. Elias went to his room at 2 in the afternoon. He packed 2 suitcases. He took the few watches he had managed to get my father to gift him. He took the cash from the household petty cash box, about $3,000. And then, he simply walked out. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't offer to help fight the legal battle. He didn't stand by his newfound father. He walked past Richard in the hallway. "Where are you going?" my father had asked. Looking at the suitcases. "I have a business opportunity in Miami," Elias had said, not breaking stride. "This situation is too toxic for me. You guys need to work this out. Good luck." He got into an Uber and left. Just like that. The prodigal son. The replacement. The future of the dynasty. Fled the moment the check bounced. My father was left standing in the hallway, watching the door close on his legacy. He was left with a wife who was medicating herself into a stupor, a lawyer who had committed malpractice, and a daughter who was currently aiming a legal cannon at his head. He was alone. The call came on Friday morning, 6 hours before the deadline. It was Myers again, but the rage was gone. The arrogance was gone. He sounded like a man who had not slept in 3 days. "Ms. West," he said to Samantha, "we would like to request a settlement conference. We are listening." Samantha said, "We cannot pay $47 million. Myers said, his voice pleading. "The liquidity isn't there. We would have to sell the manor. We would have to sell the art. It would be a fire sale. You know that. That is not our problem." "Arthur?" Samantha said. "Please," Myers said. Richard is broken. Elias has left. The staff have walked out. The house is falling apart. We are prepared to offer a significant settlement, but we need to keep the house. We need to keep the ledger sealed." I signaled to Samantha. She nodded. "We are willing to meet," Samantha said, "but not at your office, and not at the manor." Where Myers asked. "My office," Samantha said. "Neutral ground. Today at 2:00. And Arthur." "Yes." "Bring the checkbook." I hung up the phone. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even relief. It was the heavy, solid feeling of a debt finally being paid. They were coming to me. The kings and queens of Connecticut were coming to Midtown Manhattan to bend the knee to the help. I stood up and walked to the mirror in Samantha's office. I adjusted my blazer. I looked at the woman in the reflection. I was 37 years old. I was unemployed. I was estranged from my entire family, and I had never looked better. I turned to Samantha. "Let's get lunch," I said. "I want a steak, rare. We have a meeting in 2 hours," she warned. I smiled. "They will wait." I said, "They have 21 years of waiting to catch up on." The conference room at West & Associates was a study in sterile intimidation. The walls were glass, the table was polished granite, and the air conditioning was set to a temperature that discouraged loitering. I arrived exactly at 2:00. I did not rush. I did not check my reflection in the glass. I walked in with the steady, measured pace of a woman who holds the mortgage on the building, figuratively speaking. When I entered, the silence that greeted me was heavy, smelling of stale coffee and desperation. My parents were sitting on the far side of the table. I had not seen them in face-to-face for nearly a month, but it looked as if a decade had passed. My father, Richard, usually the picture of vitality and arrogance, looked shrunken inside his suit. His skin was gray, his eyes rimmed with red exhaustion. He was not the lion of industry anymore. He was just an old man who had lost his kingdom. My mother, Eleanor, was worse. She was not wearing her usual heavy makeup. Her hair, typically coiffed into a helmet of perfection, was pulled back in a severe, messy bun. She was clutching a tissue in her hand, twisting it into shreds. She looked at me when I entered, and her eyes filled with tears. Not tears of love, I knew. Tears of a woman who was watching her lifestyle evaporate. Arthur Myers sat between them. He looked like a man who had survived a shipwreck only to wash up on an island inhabited by cannibals. He stood up when I entered, a reflex of respect he had never shown me when I was merely the help. "Ms. Pennington," Myers said, his voice raspy. "Thank you for coming." I did not sit down immediately. I stood at the head of the table, looking at them. I am here because my lawyer advised me that you are ready to cure the breach of contract, I said, my voice cool and detached. Richard looked up. His hands were trembling on the table. Claudia, he croaked, please, sit down. We need to talk. I sat. I placed my hands on the table, palms down. We are listening, Samantha said from beside me. Richard took a deep breath. He looked at my mother, then back at me. We are a family. Claudia, he began, his voice wobbling. This has gone too far. The lawyers, the threats, the frozen accounts. We are destroying each other. Your mother hasn't slept in weeks. I admit mistakes were made. But we can fix this. Come home. We can work out a new arrangement. He was trying to charm me. He was trying to use the old tools: guilt, obligation, the vague promise of working it out. He thought that if he just reminded me that we shared DNA, I would drop the lawsuit and go back to fixing his Wi-Fi and hiding his affairs. I looked at him, and I felt absolutely nothing. The cord had been cut. I leaned forward slightly. You are mistaken. Richard, I said, this is not a family dispute. You made that very clear in the morning room when you fired me. You said, and I quote, "This is business. You are no longer useful." He flinched as if I had slapped him. I was angry. He stammered, "You were honest." I corrected him, "And you were right. It is business. You fired me. You terminated my contract without just cause, and now, the bill is due." I looked at Myris. "Stop the emotional appeals. Arthur, they do not work on me anymore. Let us discuss the settlement." Myers sighed. He opened a thick file folder. "We have liquidated the portfolio," Myers said, his voice flat. "It was difficult. The market is down. We had to sell the blue-chip stocks at a loss. We have leveraged the Hamptons' property. We have taken a bridge loan against the art collection." He slid a document across the granite table. "This is a cashier's check for $45 million, Myers said. I looked at the piece of paper. It was just a slip of paper. Really, blue and white security patterns. But it represented 21 years of missed birthdays, 21 years of solving problems that weren't mine, 21 years of being treated like a piece of furniture, $45 million. It was slightly less than the 47 we had calculated. But Samantha had advised me that this was the liquidity ceiling. If we demanded more, they would have to sell Sterling Manor itself, which would take months or years. This was the cash they could put on the table today. I looked at the number. It was enough. It was more than enough. And the non-monetary terms I asked, not touching the check yet. Myers gritted his teeth. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a letter on Sterling Trust letterhead. "A formal letter of apology," Myers said, spitting the words out, "and a letter of recommendation attesting to your role as the primary architect of the estate's growth from 2005 to present. Citing your exemplary management and financial genius." He slid that across the table, too. I picked up the letter of recommendation. I read it carefully. It was glowing. It was the kind of reference that would open the door to any boardroom in Manhattan. It was the truth. Finally put in writing, I looked at my mother. She was weeping silently now. "We have to sell the yacht," she whispered, her voice broken. "We have to sell the summer house. How will we show our faces at the club? Claudia, everyone will know." I looked at her with a calm curiosity. She was losing her toys. I had lost my youth. The scales were balancing. "You will manage. Eleanor," I said, "you still have the manor. You still have a pension. You will just have to learn to live within a budget. I suggest you cancel the organic flower delivery service. That saves $3,000 a month." She gasped, horrified that I knew the exact cost of her roses. I turned to Richard. "Sign the transfer order," I said. Richard picked up his pen. His hand shook so badly he could barely hold it. He looked at the check one last time. $45 million. It was a third of what was left of his fortune. He was signing away his ego. He signed. He pushed the paper toward me. He looked defeated. A king who had been forced to abdicate. "There," he whispered. "Are you happy now I picked up the check?" I handed it to Samantha, who scanned it with her phone to initiate the immediate wire deposit into my new offshore trust account. I am not happy. Richard, I said quietly, I am paid. There is a difference. We waited in silence. 3 minutes, 4 minutes. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and my mother's sniffles. Then, Samantha's phone pinged. Funds verified and cleared. Samantha said, "The money is in your account. Claudia?" I nodded. I reached into my blazer pocket. I pulled out a small, folded piece of notepaper. "Here," I said, sliding it across the table to Miras. "What is this?" Miras asked. "The keys to the kingdom." I said. He unfolded it. On it was written a single string of 64 random characters. "That is the master encryption key," I explained. "It unlocks the server, the bank accounts, the tax records, and the vendor lists. It is case sensitive. Do not lose it. If you lose it, there is no recovery." Myers clutched the paper as if it were a lifeline. "And one more thing," I said. I stood up. "The system is set to require a password change every 30 days. The next rotation is in 12 days. I suggest you hire someone competent to manage it. I am no longer available for technical support." I smoothed my blazer. I picked up my bag. "Claudia," my mother called out. She stood up, her eyes wide. "Where are you going?" I looked at her. "I am going to live my life." "Eleanor, but will we see you?" Richard asked. He looked pathetic. He realized, too late, that he had not just lost a manager, he had lost his daughter. Thanksgiving. Christmas, surely, this business is over now. I looked at them. I felt a flicker of pity, but it was distant, like watching a stranger struggle with a heavy door. "The business is over," I said. "But the relationship, that was part of the business, wasn't it?" I turned and walked to the door. Samantha followed me. We walked out of the conference room, down the long hallway lined with abstract art. Sitting on a bench in the reception area was Elias Thorne. He looked terrible. His suit was rumpled. He had not shaved. He was holding a plastic cup of water. He had evidently been dragged back from whatever hole he had hidden in, likely because his credit cards had been canceled and he had nowhere else to go. He looked up as I approached. He saw the way I walked, shoulders back, head high. He saw the victory in my stride. He shrank back against the wall, pulling his legs in as if afraid I might step on him. I stopped in front of him. I looked down. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps an insult, perhaps a plea, but no words came out. He was empty. He was a shell of a man who had tried to play a game he didn't understand. I did not say a word to him. He was not worth the breath. I simply stepped past him, the heels of my boots clicking rhythmically on the floor. I walked through the glass doors of the law firm and pressed the button for the elevator. When the doors opened, I stepped in. I watched the hallway disappear as the steel doors slid shut, sealing away the toxicity, the greed, and the past. I walked out of the building onto 42nd Street. The air in New York City was cold and smelled of exhaust and roasted nuts, but to me, it smelled like oxygen, pure, unadulterated oxygen. I stood on the sidewalk, watching the yellow taxis stream by. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a number I did not recognize. "Hello," I answered. "Ms. Pennington." A smooth, professional voice asked, "This is David Sterling, no relation. I assure you from the Vanguard Heritage Group, we manage family offices for the ultra-high net worth individuals in Europe." I listened. "We heard about your departure from the Sterling Trust." The voice continued. "Word travels fast in our circles. A manager who can turn a bankruptcy into a $200 million empire is a rare commodity. We would like to fly you to London. We have a client, a royal family actually, who needs someone with your specific skill set. The starting package is $5 million a year." I held the phone to my ear. I looked at the chaotic, beautiful city around me. $5 million a year. It was a good offer, a great offer. I smiled. "Thank you for the call." "David," I said. "So, can we schedule a meeting?" he asked eagerly. "Call me in 6 months." I said, 6 months? He stammered. But what will you be doing until then? I looked up at the sky. It was a brilliant, piercing blue. I'm going to learn how to do nothing, I said. I hung up the phone. I turned it off. I dropped it into my bag. I raised my hand and hailed a taxi. It pulled over instantly. Where to? Lady the driver asked. JFK Airport. I said. Which terminal? He asked. International. I said, I will pick a destination when I get there. Somewhere warm. Somewhere with no Wi-Fi. Somewhere where nobody knows my name. The driver laughed. Sounds like a plan. He merged into traffic. I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes. For the first time in 21 years, I had no schedule. I had no obligations. I had no master. The car accelerated, moving away from the shadow of the skyscrapers. Moving toward the horizon, I was free. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed Claudia's journey from being an undervalued daughter to a woman who claimed her worth. I would love to hear from you. Please comment below and tell me where you are listening to this story from. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Sunday Drama Stories, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach more people who need a little inspiration to stand up for themselves. See you in the next story.